In this video, we're going to talk about a new AI code assistant called Amazon Q that was just released recently. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, you guys probably already know and have been using AI code assistants already because they are becoming pretty ubiquitous currently, and the trend is going to continue even more in the next years. And I believe AI code assistants in general are going to become huge and basically an essential part of every engineer's skill set. And I myself, as a DevOps and cloud engineer, use the AI code assistants mostly for writing infrastructure, provisioning, and configuration scripts, and so on. And I mostly work with AWS, so I write automation scripts for provisioning and configuring AWS infrastructure and its services. Now, there are two most important questions related to the value of AI code assistants or generative AI tools like Amazon Q. The first one is the quality of the output or the responses that it generates. In our engineering use case, it's the quality of code suggestions or improvements, troubleshooting, and explanation of code that the tool generates. So if I'm using a code assistant for working on AWS cloud platform, then the tool needs to have extensive knowledge and understanding of AWS services, the best practices of configuration, the production best practices, architecture elements of cloud infrastructure, and so on. And probably the most important of all, that data needs to be up to date. Because in TechWorld, you guys know how fast everything changes. So there is really no value in getting an old version of configuration or outdated code suggestions when writing automation scripts. And in this case, a huge benefit of Amazon Q is that it's created by AWS itself. So it has deep, extensive knowledge of AWS services, configuration, architecture, and so on. And that can have a huge impact on the quality of output. So in general, an extremely important aspect of AI code assistant tools is how much you can rely on the output it generates. And the second question related to the value of such tools is the use cases they cover. So what are those AI tools good for, and why would you want to use them in the first place? Can they actually help you 10x your speed and efficiency when working on complex DevOps or cloud projects? Can they help you become a better engineer, or are they not yet mature enough to actually be of any help? Well, that's exactly what we're going to see in practice in this video. So make sure to stay till the end. So how does Amazon Q actually work? And how can it assist us, or what tasks can it help us with when we are working on a project as engineers? We can integrate Amazon Q in our code editor or IDE using a plugin or extension, and we can start using it directly inside the IDE. So we can use it directly while writing the code or analyzing code without having to leave the IDE. And there are three main categories of tasks that Amazon Q can help us with. The first one is understanding the code or concepts themselves. So for example, if you are new to a project and the team has already written automation project that has been developing for multiple months or years, there's going to be a huge code base that you're going to have to understand. For example, you have a Terraform project that provisions AWS infrastructure with various different services, like configures an EKS cluster and integrates it with different AWS services, then creates some IAM roles and permissions, creates some Kubernetes components. So let's say there's a lot of things going on in the project, and you need an easy way to understand that Terraform code, especially if you are a junior engineer and your Terraform knowledge is not as good. You can use Amazon Q to help you understand the high level of the project or blocks of code, as well as specific lines of what they're configuring, what they're provisioning, and so on. And you can use Amazon Q to learn and understand things that are not directly related to your code. So maybe you want to have a high-level understanding of AWS services or integration of multiple services, understand a certain architecture, and so on. So that's the first category of answers that you can get from Amazon Q, which is explanation and understanding things. The second one is Amazon Q actually generating code for you. So let's say you're using a Terraform module and you need to check the documentation to understand how to use that module, what attributes that module takes, what values should be set for those attributes, and so on. So in this case, you can describe what you want to write and let Amazon Q actually generate that code for you. So now, in addition to giving Amazon Q some kind of code to analyze, it actually generates a code for some kind of new configuration or provisioning logic. In the same category or code generation, you can also use Amazon Q to adjust your existing code to make improvements or to refactor the code, maybe with a cleaner syntax, or maybe extracting some values as parameters and so on. And this is actually a feature I use quite often, which is feeding an existing code that works, but making an improvement in the code and logic itself to cover the best practices, for example. And the last category of use cases that you can use Amazon Q for is troubleshooting and analysis. You're probably already used to it. You spend 20% of your time writing the code, writing the configuration, and probably 80% of the time troubleshooting the issues if something goes wrong. So troubleshooting is an important and very integral part of our job as engineers. So that's again something that AI code assistants like Amazon Q will help you with. An example of that would be if you're getting errors in your output. Sometimes those errors are not very self-explanatory. So usually you would copy paste the error message and Google it. And that would be a perfect use case of asking Amazon Q to actually analyze that issue for you, explain to you what that issue is, and giving a suggestion on how to fix it. So as you see, there are a bunch of tasks and use cases that we have to do as engineers. And now we're going to actually see some of those use cases in practice and how Amazon Q can help us in those tasks. And with that, let's dive right into testing out and trying Amazon Q for an actual infrastructure automation project for AWS. So I'm using Visual Studio Code as my editor, and I have my very simple Terraform project that basically configures an EKS cluster with its corresponding VPC. So a basic configuration to keep things simple. And in order to use Amazon Q in my Visual Studio Code, I can simply install that as an extension. So as you see, it's an official plugin from Amazon.com. And once you install that, you're going to see this icon here or a tab for Amazon Q. If I click inside, I see an option to sign in, and then we're going to be able to use Amazon Q. And conveniently enough, we have this very simple mode of being able to sign in without an AWS account and also use it for free as part of the free tier. So I'm going to click here. Let's continue. And we simply need to confirm the authorization. And as you see here, you can create a new AWS Builder ID, or you can sign in to your existing one. And I'm actually going to create a new one just to show you how it's going to look like. And you can paste the verification code that you got on the email, verify. We set the password, and there you go. The Builder ID is created. So now we can sign in. And you're going to be navigated to your profile view. We're going to allow access, and this will create the authentication so that we can use Amazon Q in our Visual Studio Code editor, which means if I go back, we should see Amazon Q successfully connected to your Builder ID account, and now it's ready to be used. And what you see here, this Amazon Q tab is a chat window. So chat is one way of interacting with Amazon Q to ask it any questions that you want. So here is a place I mentioned. You can use Amazon Q to analyze your code blocks, your entire project, to ask it any questions not directly related to code, maybe to learn some new concepts, learn things about different AWS services or even other technologies, find the right Terraform module for your task, and so on. So this is a place where you can ask questions to Amazon Q. And the chat is what we're going to do for our project as well. So I'm going to close this, and we can also create multiple chats to keep our questions separated. So let's go ahead and start using Amazon Q for our Terraform project to help us with some interesting tasks. So let me open my main Terraform file that defines creation of EKS, and I'm going to ask Amazon Q to explain the Terraform project code for me in detail. And it gives me the explanation of different parts of the code, from EKS creation to what variables are defined for what, so name and Kubernetes version, which we have right here, the managed node group, all the cluster add-ons, and so on, and also gives us a summary of what this project is creating. Now let's actually ask Amazon Q to optimize, or let's ask whether we should optimize anything in our project. And let's see what it responded. So first of all, it gives us a little overview of the things that we have correctly done in the project. So for example, the usage of version with the tilde that helps us automatically update to the next minor version. So Amazon Q is suggesting that it's a good practice, as well as setting the create cluster security group to false and installing those default add-ons in the cluster. And it found some optimization opportunities, some improvements that we can make. It's suggesting to extract this VPC and subnet configuration. So if we have other resources that we want to create also in the same VPC, in addition to EKS, then we can reuse that VPC. It also is telling us, and this is actually quite a good suggestion, to increase the instance type, because T3 micro is actually pretty small for lots of the services. Like if we were installing Ingress controller, Argo CD, or some databases, this would probably be small for most of those services. So it's suggesting to change it to a larger size and also add additional managed node group. And this is also a good one to output some values as a result of infrastructure creation for easy access. Like for example, a command to connect to EKS cluster and get the kubeconfig file. So now we can actually ask Amazon Q to generate code or give us code examples of all those improvement suggestions. So I'm going to ask it to give me code and here is the part where Amazon Q generates code examples for you. This is for extracting VPC and private subnets using larger instances, the output file, and so on. Now, this brings me to another usage of Amazon Q that you probably are going to use much more for the generative code. So if you want an AI code assistant to actually auto-suggest code blocks or code lines or refactor your code, you would use that directly in your editor. So we have a chat here, and then you have inline code suggestions. So let's say we leave this managed node group with T3 micro. So if we have any pods that can be scheduled on such a small node, we're going to leave it for those. But in addition, we're going to create another node group with larger instance type. And let's let Amazon Q generate that code for us. First of all, you see already that it is giving us suggestion, and you can toggle to see different versions. And I'm going to write a comment here EKS managed node group with T3 large instance type. And you can autocomplete with tab. And again, we can also specify additional details in our description or comment of what Amazon Q will generate. So let's say we want a node group with a specific name. Let's call it main, with max size 5, desired 2. And let's see what we get. There you go. And as you see, we have these continuous inline code suggestions that we're getting. So let's say if I was creating another resource, let's say I want to use another module, Amazon Q is continuously trying to guess what configuration I want to add to my project. And as you see, it actually comes up with multiple suggestions, which I can toggle. So in case I want EKS node group configuration, or EKS Fargate, or EKS Blueprints Kubernetes add-ons, which is actually a module that lets you install a bunch of services directly in the cluster just by enabling them. So I'm gonna take over this configuration and adding tags. And let's do a quick test here, and let's make sure that the source, the version that we're getting, is actually a new one or recent one. And let's check this on GitHub. And this is version 4.27. So this is the version that it gave us. Now let me use chat one more time, and I'm gonna ask it to configure or enable CloudTrail logs for my EKS cluster. So let me ask Amazon Q how I can do it. And these are the steps of how we can do that. So first, it suggests to create an IAM role that will have permission to write CloudTrail logs to CloudWatch. So that's the Terraform configuration for the role, which CloudTrail service can assume. Then we have the role permissions themselves. So that's the policy that allows creation and reading of the logs and log groups. And then using this configuration, this will enable CloudTrail logs on EKS cluster. Now let's do one final question here on a project, and I'm going to ask it to give me any additional Terraform configuration for my EKS cluster based on security and production best practices. And now let's see what we get. It is telling us to enable the Kubernetes audit logs so that we have all the activity that's going on in the cluster captured in the logs in case we have a hack, so we can do a security analysis. It's also suggesting us to enforce security policies on what pods can do. So basically escalating any privilege within the pod. So that is a security configuration to make sure that cluster can only be talked to within the VPC. The security group configuration for the node groups, the Kubernetes node groups. This is a good one, enabling EKS encryption to encrypt the etcd data, adding monitoring for cluster health, like Prometheus, for example, and so on. So it's giving us some suggestions to improve security and basically make our EKS cluster more production ready. And one thing I want to note here is that Amazon Q actually provides the resources or references for the answers it generates. So it basically tells you, here's the answer, and by the way, I'm referencing these different resources so you can actually go and check. And this is what I do most of the time. When I get an AI generated answer, I usually validate. I want to make sure I know which source this comes from, whether it's an official documentation, a blog article, what year it was written, so how up to date that resource is, and so on. So you can check that source and basically get some additional context for whatever the reply was. And you have that for most of the replies. So for example, here, we know that this part is referenced in this resource, and so on. Now, let me show you another feature that I personally find more interesting than the regular chat or inline code suggestions. And that is the dev mode, basically. And as you see by the description, what this dev mode gives you is it increases your context for the questions that you ask Amazon Q. So Amazon Q can take your entire project as a context for answering your questions instead of just the files that are open in your editor. But the thing that I find cool about this feature is that you can actually use it to give you a very high-level plan for complex tasks. So if I want to configure something in my EKS cluster that's integrating with various technologies and I have multiple steps to actually execute that, I can ask Amazon Q for a plan of how to actually do that complex thing. So let's try this out. And as you see, a new tab gets created for this dev mode. And the answer generation takes a little longer because one, Amazon Q is using your entire project. And second, it is giving you a more detailed and thorough reply. So let's see what we get. So it's telling us to enable Argo CD in our main TF file using EKS Blueprints Kubernetes add-ons. So this is a module that, as I mentioned, allows you to toggle or basically very easily switch on different plugins, and one of them is Argo CD. So that's how it's suggesting to install Argo CD, which is fine. It's even telling us to create a Git repository that we can sync with Argo CD, telling us to use customization files for Kubernetes manifest, and at the end, even add some automated testing. So this is kind of a high-level overview of what steps we can do. Let's try another example. Let's say I want to install and run Vault in my cluster, and I want to use AWS KMS service to generate and store the encryption key for Vault. And I'm going to ask Amazon Q for a plan of how to implement this with my Terraform project. So again, I'm going to do dev. And let's see what we get. And this is our plan. Again, IAM role with necessary permissions, as always, using a module to deploy Vault that references that IAM role, the Vault configuration, the Vault init script for the initial provisioning. And now I'm actually going to ask it to give me details and code snippets for all the steps in the plan. And here we're getting the configuration snippets, like creating the role that processes in the EKS cluster can assume, Vault module, and so on. Now, one thing that is clear is that you can't directly take this code and implement it because it's not going to work. Some of the steps are not fully correct. So when I'm using this feature, what I'm getting the most value from is the high-level roadmap sort of that points me into the right direction where I can then zoom in and either do follow-up questions on Amazon Q or get the additional up-to-date details from the documentation of different tools that I need. So at this point, Amazon Q is a tool that will help you finalize and create your configuration code or infrastructure code with iterations. It's not going to do the entire programming and write the entire Terraform project for you. One more thing we can do in dev mode is have Amazon Q generate the code files for us. When we ask Amazon Q to generate code, it basically creates the contents in those files that you can take over in your existing file if you want to. So if I click here, it actually shows me this view that shows me kind of a difference or addition in my existing file. And if I want to insert the code, I can do this. And it also created this kms.tf file and also updated the variables with Vault version. And I can close the session or work on a new task once I'm done with this one. Now, I want to show you one final feature of Amazon Q, which is actually integrated directly into your AWS account. So switching to the browser, this is my AWS account. And by the way, you have Amazon Q as one of the services. And right here, you see the same icon that we had in our editor. This one right here. And this is actually the integrated Amazon Q. And you can use it here to get insights to resources within your specific AWS account, which is actually very convenient if you're provisioning resources in multiple regions. If you have, let's say, EC2 instances running in different places, if you have some other resources attached to those, you can actually query those resources directly here, or you can use it just like your code assistant to ask it specific questions and get explanations, or even get some troubleshooting advice. So for example, I want to check how many EC2 instances I have currently in the running state in this region. And in this region, I actually have 3 instances running, and it lists all those 3 instances with direct links so that I can jump into one of those. Let's do another one. Let's try listing all the subnets. And it's giving me a list of all 6 subnets in this region. We can also ask Amazon Q to give us AWS commands, for example. So let's ask it, what is AWS CLI command for creating a new IAM role? And it's printing out the command as well as what parameters you can specify to that command. And now let's give it additional details of what the role should be allowed to do and who can assume that. And let's see what we get. And there you go. We have this create role with the name, my role that I provided, and the policy for EC2 instances to be able to assume this role. And then we have the actual permission using the AWS managed policy. So this is another use case of using Amazon Q, either here or, of course, directly in your IDE. So this was a demonstration of Amazon Q AI code assistant and some of its features. And I hope I was able to demonstrate how it can be used, some of the use cases, so you get a full picture of how you can use it yourself in practice in your engineering projects. And as always, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.